self. Am I not in front of the screen? No, it's okay. So there are many ways to address the question between the relation between the body and the self. One might ask ontological questions, for instance, am I a body or do I own a body? Other kind of question would be more like kind of ethical question. Does one have property right upon the body? And if so, who owns the body? Another set of questions is question about that could be called psychological, and by that I mean question about the sense of body ownership. By that I mean I am aware that this body is mine. But what does it take to be aware that this body is mine? What grounds the sense of body ownership? Is it grounded on bodily sensations, this sensation I have of my body from the inside? Is it grounded on action, the fact that I can control my body? Or is it maybe grounded in emotion, the fact that I would have a kind of affective relation to this body more than for any other body? So that's another set of questions. But here I'm not going to address this question. Rather, I'm going to address epistemological question, and more particularly in relation with the notion of immunity to errors in identification. So briefly, to give you an overview of my talk, in the first part I will just describe a little bit more what I mean by immunity to error, and in particular in relation to bodily self-ascription. In the second part I will consider two putative counter-examples to the notion of bodily immunity coming from psychology and from neuropsychology. So the case of somatoparaphrenia, which is a neurological disorder of some patients who deny that their own hand is their own. And the case of the recently discovered bodily illusion known as the rubber hand illusion. I will describe them more in detail and see whether they show that there is nothing like bodily immunity to error. And finally, I will assess the consequences of the fact that most of our bodily self-knowledge is grounded on the interaction between vision and body senses. I will see how the fact that bodily self-knowledge is essentially multimodal and what consequences this has for immunity to error. So let me start with the notion of immunity. So the notion of immunity can be tracked back more or less to Wittgenstein and Shoemaker. So Wittgenstein draws this very famous distinction between two uses of the self as a subject and the self as an object. And these two uses of the self have different epistemic behavior. So for the self as an object, let's take the example, I am Frederick. The fact is that as identity, it's not me who is Frederick. You invited the wrong person, I'm sorry. And the ascription is sensitive to identification of the subject. It could be someone else who is Frederick. Now if you compare that with the self as a subject, I feel anxious. When I say I feel anxious, my judgment wise, my emotional state, and maybe but there is one type of that this judgment seems to be immune to, and that's error through misidentification of the subject. In other words, it doesn't seem to make sense to ask the following question. Someone feels anxious. This question just does not seem to make sense. So since Wittgenstein and Shoemaker they have of immunity and to try to sense to ask whether I am the person who, while Shoemaker will say I cannot be mistaken about the person who is anxious. And more recently, Jim Pryor suggested that we should rather formulate this way, I cannot rationally doubt that I am the person who is anxious. And this different way to spell out the notion of immunity is related to different levels of explanation of the phenomenon of immunity. For some people, like Shoemaker, immunity has to be related to conceptual truth, to the truth, logical truth of mental concepts. For instance, when I say, I feel in pain, it's part of the definition of pain that if I feel in pain, then it cannot be someone else who is in pain. So that will be just a derivative of the notion of pain. By contrast, other people, including Jim Pryor, but also Gareth Evans, will rather link immunity to the infrarational or rational structure of self-knowledge. Here, I'm not going to go into the differences between the different versions of immunity, Yes, like many distinctions have been done. There are now several kinds of immunity, and it will be too long to go into that. Here we just assume whether, like Jim Pryor's views, that is something related to the rational structure of self-knowledge. And when I mean immunity, I mean something like I cannot rationally doubt that I am the person who instantiates the property. So now that we have a better grasp of the notion of immunity, let's see how it could work. And one thing that is important to note is that I say, okay, I feel anxious and this is immune to error. But this is not always true. Let's imagine a case where I say I am anxious, not because I feel it by introspection, but because my psychoanalyst told me so. But it might happen that my analyst just confused me with another patient, and actually the other patient was anxious and it's not me. And because I believe everything my analyst says, then I will say, well, I'm anxious. Well, here we have typically a case where my self-ascription of an emotion, which should be immune to error, is not immune because it's based not on introspection, but on my analyst. Then, what is important here, I take that as an example to illustrate the fact that immunity does not apply to proposition per se. It applies to proposition made upon specific ground. It's really the fact that this judgment, I am anxious, is based on introspection that is important. It's the relationship between the judgment and the grounds that can secure immunity to error. And this is interesting because most interest on immunity has focused on psychological immunity, that is on the ascription of mental state like emotion or belief or desire or pain, etc. But if what matters is the grounds, then we can imagine that there are other properties, other predicates that we could self-ascribe and that would be also possibly immune to error if they are grounded appropriately. And that means that we could imagine that bodily self-ascription could be immune. And that's what I'm going to focus on. So I'm not going to talk about psychological immunity. I'm really going to focus on bodily immunity. So the question I want to raise is, are self-ascription of physical bodily properties immune to error smooth identification? So let's take the example. I feel my leg crossed. So the question I'm interested in is not whether I am sure I am the person who feel my leg crossed. Because of course, here it's the self-ascription of a mental state, the mental state of feeling the legs crossed. And as I said, it's not going to be the question I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is really in the question whether those are my legs that are crossed and nobody else's legs. And what can make me sure that those are my legs? Is it possible that I'm mistaken? So that's the question I will raise. And you can spell out more or less three related questions on bodily immunity. The question I will mainly focus is the first one. What are the appropriate grounds for bodily immunity? What can really secure the fact that my bodily self-ascription is immune to error smooth identification? So that will be my main question. But there are two other related questions that have been raised in the literature concerning bodily immunity. The other is trying to compare bodily immunity with psychological immunity. Is it one and the same phenomenon, or is it something different? Well, I will come back briefly later on that. Most of the time it's argued that there are different phenomena because in the case of psychological immunity, it would be something more logical, more about the mental concepts, while in the case of bodily immunity, something de facto. I will comment on that later. A further question that has been raised is about the ontological nature of the self. Some people, like for example Qasim Qassam or Gareth Evans, have argued that the fact that bodily self-ascription can be immune to error shows that the self is, its nature is bodily and not only mental. So the bodily immunity has been used in a kind of metaphysical debate. That's the point I will really not address here in this talk. And actually, it's not obvious that we can draw consequences from the epistemology to metaphysics in this case. So here will be my primary question about the grounds of bodily immunity. And roughly speaking, when it comes to bodily self-knowledge, there are two types of perceptual ground. On the one hand, I have what we might call the external senses, that is, for example, vision, that gives me information about my body. I can see my hand, and that gives me information. And for instance, I can judge that my legs are crossed based on vision. On the other hand, we have what we might call body senses, that is, all these senses about one's body, where even when you close your eyes, you know that your legs are crossed, and you know that how? You know that by proprioception. We have this range of sensation, bodily experiences, that seems to be from the inside, and like that we have the sense of balance, we have the sense of temperature, tactile sensation, of course, proprioception, and so on and so forth. And that's what I call body senses. And the question is, do these two types of perceptual ground lead to similar judgment, or do they lead to judgment that have different epistemic properties? So if you look at vision, well, of course, I can see my body, but I can see maybe, I don't know how many bodies there are in this room, but I can see many bodies. And it's easy to see how I need to identify the body I see as mine, because there are so many bodies that I can see, therefore I need this identification component. So if there is an identification component, if I need to identify which body it is or whose body it is, then that means that I can misidentify the body. And therefore, vision, at least visual judgment about the body, are not immune to misidentification. Now let us compare that with body senses when I say my legs are crossed based on proprioception, where here it seems that we have a privileged access to our body, and to our body only. I cannot, if I close my eyes, I have no way to know whether your legs are crossed or not. It's only on my own body that I know if my legs are crossed or not. So the fact is, in our world, we are hired in such a way that these body senses give us access only to our body. And so that's more or less what Evans argued, is like, I quote, we have a proprioceptive sense of balance, of heat and cold, and of pressure. Each of these modes of perception appears to give rise to judgment, which is immune to errors of identification. So the idea is really, when bodily self-ascription are based on body senses, then there is what he calls de facto bodily immunity. So we seem to have a nice asymmetry between the two types of perceptual ground. And that leads us to kind of what I call the bodily immunity thesis, which is more or less well accepted. I don't know, I mean, there are not many people who are against it. And that's the idea that when bodily self-ascription are grounded in body senses, so including proprioception, tactile sensation, sense of balance, heat and cold sensation, etc., then bodily self-ascription are de facto immune to error. And they are only de facto immune to error, because you could imagine a possible world where actually my proprioceptive system is connected with another person's body. And in this situation, in this thought experiment, then when I have access from the inside for proprioception, that the legs are crossed, some legs are crossed, then I can be wrong. It could be my leg or it could be someone else's leg, the person I'm hired to. So I'm connected to. So then in this possible world, body senses will no longer guarantee bodily immunity. So that's why it says that immunity is only de facto for the bodily self-ascription, because it's true only in our actual world. So that's the mild version, let's say, That's the mild version of the bodily immunity thesis. Now we can imagine a stronger version of the bodily immunity thesis. And that's what I call the exclusive bodily immunity thesis. On this view, bodily self-ascription are is that the more bodily self-knowledge will be multimodal, that is, the more it will be based on the interaction between body senses and vision, the less there will be bodily judgments that are immune to error. And I will come back later on that point. But I just wanted to show it now because that's a strong version of the bodily immunity thesis. And what I'm going to do during this talk is actually criticize this exclusive bodily immunity thesis. I'm going to criticize the fact that the grounds that guarantee immunity includes only bodily senses. I will show that in some circumstances vision also can guarantee bodily immunity. And I will also analyze two possible cases that show that body senses that could show that body senses do not always guarantee immunity. And I will also criticize the first assumption according to which bodily self-description are immune if it's based on the grounds that can guarantee immunity only. So let me now first consider whether at least the mild version, that is bodily immunity thesis, is true or not. Is it true that when we have access to our body through body senses, or bodily judgment are immune to error? Well, first let me make a distinction between two kinds of error of strong identification that could be made. There is what I call false negative. That is a case where one does not self-describe properties that are instantiated by one's own body. So, for instance, my hands are crossed, but I don't say it's my hand, I say it's someone else's hands. And we see that's instantiated, or at least illustrated, by the case of patient with somatoparaphrenia. A second possible kind of error is what I call false positive. Here we have a case where one self-described properties that are instantiated by another body. So that's the case where I see arms crossed just in front of me, and I believe that those are my arms that are crossed. And we see that what happens in the rubber hand illusion. And so these two cases might seem as if they challenge the bodily immunity thesis. However, I will show that not just any case of misidentification can challenge this thesis. So let me start with somatoparaphrenia. So somatoparaphrenia is a disorder caused mainly by brain lesion or sometimes also epilepsy. And what happened with this patient is that they deny the ownership of some of the limbs. So just to give you a taste of it, here is a sample of quotation from patient. So I will read them. So whose arm is this? It's not mine. Whose is it? It's my mother's. How on earth does it happen to be there? I don't know. I found it in my bed. How long has it been there? Since the first day. Feel, it's warmer than mine. The other day too. When the weather was colder, it was warmer than mine. So where's your left arm? It's under there. So here we have typically a case of a patient who is convinced that his arm is not his own, his left arm is not his own. And this patient has a strong feeling of confidence that really this is not their body. For instance, another patient said, so the doctor said, suppose I told you this was your hand, and the patient replied, I wouldn't believe you. And there's also this famous story told by the neurologist Oliver Sacks of a patient who was in bed and he fell out of his bed. And people asked, so try to understand why. And actually, it's because he found a leg in his bed. And that's disgusting. I mean, there was this leg. He didn't know whose leg it was, but there was this leg that was disgusting. So he just wanted to throw away the leg. And of course, he threw away himself out of the bed. So that just tells you the kind of experience this patient can have. So here it says that we have a case of false negative. But what is interesting is that this patient, I mean, the phenomenon by itself is already quite striking, but what is really puzzling for a philosopher is that these patients still have bodily sensation in the limbs that they deny ownership. So they can feel, if you touch them, if you pinch them, they will feel sensation in the hand that say it's not their own. So So, so it seems here that we have a case where the patient has the appropriate ground to make the right bodily self-ascription. He has tactile sensation. So if he feels tactile sensation here, he should realize in a way that this hand is his own hand. And yet he failed to do so, and even he will attribute the hand to someone else. So does it show that the bodily immunity thesis is wrong? That actually body senses fail to guarantee bodily immunity? Well, I do not think so, and here is why. So roughly, it seems that grounds are appropriate if they guarantee immunity or self-ascription, but only if self-ascription are met. That's how it works. But the presence of appropriate grounds does not suffice to guarantee that the patient will make the self-ascription. So, roughly speaking, it's like you can have plenty of good reason to believe that P, but yet not believe that P. And it is not because one does not believe that P that you don't have the good reason to believe that P. It happens all the time where we have all this situation. We should believe that P, but yet, because we have the good reason for it, and still we keep on denying P. And does that mean that we don't have a good reason to believe that P? So, in the case of the patient, the fact that they do not make the self-ascription does not show that body senses are not able to guarantee bodily immunity. They show that patients take other reason to defeat their good reason to believe that that's their own body. And it's really interesting because you want to know why, what would make this patient deny ownership of their limb despite the fact that they have the good reason to self-ascribe the limb. But this is not relevant for immunity. That means at least it cannot be taken as evidence against immunity. So let us now consider another case. The problem with patients, of course, patient studies, it's always a bit fuzzy. You don't know exactly what's going on. You don't know whether this patient have reasoning problem. You don't know all that. So it's, in a way, you could say it's just cleaner if you look just at study with healthy subjects. And that one has been done with this recently discovered rubber hand illusion. So it was discovered something like 12 years ago, in 1998. And so for the people who don't know it, here's how it works. So your own hand is hidden behind a screen, so you don't see your own hand. What you see in front of you is a rubber hand. And the two hands are stroked synchronously. So what you have is that you have a tactile sensation on your hand that you do not see, and you see it like you see the stroking of the paintbrush on the rubber hand in front of you. And after a couple of minutes, what happens is that you start feeling as if you were touched on the rubber hand. You localize the tactile sensation on the rubber hand. Furthermore, when asked to judge where your hand is, and you still have, then you have your eyes closed, you no longer see the rubber hand, but you mislocalize your hand towards the location of the rubber hand. Furthermore, if someone like threatens the rubber hand with a hammer or try to pinprick it, then you react very vividly. You have a very strong affective reaction. And finally, when asked whether you feel this rubber hand as your own, most subjects reply that yes, they feel as if the rubber hand were their own hand. And one subject like that described spontaneously, I found myself looking at the dummy hand, thinking it was actually my own. So here it seems that we have a case of false positive, where I self-ascribe a body part that does not belong to me, the rubber hand. And this has been taken as evidence against the bodily immunity thesis by Mr. Moto and Ishikawa, who says, I quote, thus, it demonstrates the case of judgment based on somatic proprioception is mistaken because of misidentification, and therefore constitute a counterexample to the immunity thesis. Well, I do not agree with them. I don't think that we can so directly draw this conclusion. And part of it is because it's not clear that we really have, that the judgments that are made by the subject are grounded on body senses only. And it's not clear whether, and I will come back later on that, this is an error thrown in identification related to the first person. So, first a question about the grounds. Here, one way to describe the rubber hand illusion is quite often visual capture of touch. So what is at stake here is the fact that you have vision that influence your tactile sensation. So the whole story about the rubber hand is really the influence of vision on your body senses. It's not just on body senses shortcut, it's really the influence of vision on body senses. And you can see that at various levels, because the property, the bodily property that subjects self-describe at the end, is visually accessible only. It's not even accessible through body senses. Like, for instance, you would say that, so let's imagine that the subject self-describes the size of the rubber hand. Like, if the rubber hand is bigger, then they will say that they have a big hand. Well, this is the size of the rubber hand is accessible only through vision and not through body senses. And even at the level where they have to identify the rubber hand as their own hand, they compare visual information with proprioceptive, with tactile information. So again, you have the involvement of vision. So it cannot be used as a claim, as an evidence against the bodily immunity thesis, because there is this constant involvement of vision, while the bodily immunity thesis is only about the body senses and the role of body senses to guarantee bodily immunity. One might ask whether it could be taken as evidence against the exclusive bodily immunity thesis, and I will comment later on that, but at least at this time, it cannot be used against bodily immunity thesis. So to wrap up a little bit this first section, well, there is no empirical evidence against the bodily immunity thesis yet. Maybe there might be later, but for now I haven't found anything convincing, and there seem to be quite good arguments to believe in the bodily immunity thesis. So we have seen that somatoparaphrenia, it's a case of false negatives that cannot be excluded by immunity. As for the rubber hand illusion, self-ascriptive judgment are based not only on body senses but also on vision. Now the question that one might ask is the role of vision in bodily self-knowledge so unusual, restricted to bodily illusion, like the rubber hand illusion? Or is it not rather that vision plays an important and almost permanent role in bodily self-knowledge? And if that's the case, how can bodily self-ascription still be immune? So I will go now to the last part of my talk, which is actually the biggest part, and that's this notion of bodily self-knowledge that could be multimodal. So to recap, there seems to be a dichotomy between two well-defined types of bodily judgment with different epistemic properties. Some are immune to error, others are not immune to error. Some are based on body senses, others are not based on vision. So it's all nice and clear-cut. However, a classical account of bodily self-knowledge and bodily self-awareness have really emphasized the importance of body senses, like you have, for instance, Jose Bermudez, who grants more or less the bodily self-awareness and even self-awareness just on proprioception. So there has been a lot of weight put on body senses, but it's at the expense of vision and other external senses. And actually what science has shown recently is that many bodily judgments result from multisensory interaction, regardless of any dichotomy between body senses and external senses. So most bodily judgments are multimodal in nature. That is, they are not just grounded in body senses, they are grounded in body senses and in external senses. But what are the consequences of this multimodality? Does it come at the cost of bodily immunity? So that's a question I will address in this next section. So let me first talk a little bit more about multimodality. I will be quite brief here because I don't want to have the whole paper on that. But we know that while I'm here, I have experiences coming from various can feel the floor on my feet. I have all these perceptual experiences at the same time coming from various sensory modalities. But not only do I have that, but these various perceptual experiences can interact with each other. So what happens is that we have information from one modality that affects the perceptual experience in another modality. And this multisensory effect can be found more or less between all sensory modalities. So it's well known, for instance, between vision and audition. For instance, there is the famous ventriloquism effect, where you feel like the person is not speaking with the puppet or dummy, and when actually it's just because you have a multisensory effect. Another famous effect is also like the crisp. If you hear at the same time that you eat the crisp or chips, I don't know how you. Well, if you hear at the same time a very crispy noise, then the crisp will taste crispier than when if you have a kind of soft noise. So you have all this interaction that has been shown, and but here I will focus just, of course, on bodily self-knowledge and so on, the interaction between body senses and external senses. So we have seen cerebral hand illusion. That's typically an example of how vision can influence touch and proprioception. Another bodily illusion is known as the parchment skin illusion. So what happens is like the subject are asked to rub their hand together like that, and at the same time they hear with headphones a distorted noise of the noise they make when rubbing their hand, such that it looks like as if you're the noise of two very dry skin of paper rubbing each other. So the subject after that report that they feel that the skin was very dry, almost like parchment, just because they had the noise that corresponded to that. So here again, you have an effect of external sense, audition, that will affect your bodily experience of the texture of your skin. Another example is what is known as prismatic adaptation. So what happened here is that subjects wear goggles which deviates the light rays, so that when let's say my hand is here, I'm wearing this prism. My hand is here, but I will see it there. So it just deviates, let's say, by 15 degrees. So I see my hand at a different location than where it is. But what is amazing is that you have also proprioceptive information about the location of your hand. And actually where you feel your hand to be is influenced by where you see it. So actually quite often it dominates. So you rely more on vision than on proprioception. And that affects not only your judgment, but even your experience. You report that you feel your hand to be there. Also, it's only because of vision. So that's all very nice and very interesting. I'm not going to list all the effects. There are many multisensory effects that have been discovered. And one thing I just want to point to is that it's not just merely anecdotal. I mean, it's not just a side effect of how the brain is hardwired. It's really something that is essential to bodily self-knowledge, because the involvement of vision, and I will restrict to vision, and not to external senses in general, but the involvement of vision plays two important roles for bodily self-knowledge. First, it plays an epistemic role. So the idea is that we have several sources of information about our body, and none of them is optimal. None of them is perfectly reliable. There is still some noise with the neural signal, and they are not always good to process spatial location, spatial properties in general. So it's optimal to combine the information when you have different sources of information. And vision has been shown to be especially good to process spatial properties. So that's why quite often vision dominates over other senses, just because vision is so good to process spatial properties. And if you have to estimate the location of your hand, either based on vision or on proprioception, you will be better with vision than proprioception. Therefore, when you have access to the two, you just combine the two and you average to find the good location of your hand. So that's the important. So vision maximizes the accuracy of bodily judgment. A second role that is played by vision is pragmatic role, and by that I mean just the fact that bodily self-knowledge is required to interact with the world, with external objects, and this world with which we interact is given to us mainly by vision. So for example, if I want to grasp a glass, then I need to look at my body related to the glass in the external environment. And how do I have access to the glass except by vision? So I need to map my bodily experiences that are on my skin in this external world, and this external world is given to us by vision. So we need vision as a kind of common frame of reference, because that's the frame of reference of the world where we move and we interact with objects. So that's the two types of roles that vision plays, and I'm not going in detail, but in a different paper I argue that actually we would not have the same kind of bodily experiences if we were blind. And I'm not going to go into the details of all the results, but mainly it has been shown that blind people, I'm not saying of course that they do not have bodily experiences, of course they do, but they have bodily experiences of a different kind, and in particular it has been shown, for instance, that they are less good in judging the size of their body parts. Because, I mean, if you just take the example of the size of your hand, of your arm, how do you compute it if you do not have vision? I mean, you can bump into an object and after that you realize how much, but if you are blind, bump into an object, how do you know the respective size of your finger, of your forearm, of your upper arm? You just bump into the object. So it's very difficult to compute the size of body parts if you do not have vision. And this is reflected in blind people, because when you ask them to more or less give an evaluation of the metrics of their body parts, they are quite bad. So that's just an example, but just to illustrate the fact that vision plays such an essential role for bodily self-knowledge that we are impaired when we don't have it. So now that we have seen that bodily self-knowledge has really something multimodal about it, let's see what consequences it has for immunity. So if we go back to the exclusive bodily thesis that I told you before, so I've said that bodily self-ascription are immune if they are based on body senses and on nothing else. What I've just described is actually bodily self-ascription most of the time are based on body senses and on something else, on vision. So what does that mean? So should we give up the notion of immunity? Well, I do not think so. I think that first we should challenge the second assumption, according to which the grounds that guarantee immunity include body senses only. And I want, in a way, to rehabilitate vision, to save vision, to show that vision is not such a bad guy when it comes to immunity. So, if we go back to vision, as I said before, we have access to many bodies, and not only to our own bodies for vision. And because of that, there is a gap. I use Evans' terminology, but there is a gap between visually knowing that a body is F and visually knowing that it is my own body that is F, because I can see many bodies. And it's funny that in the literature, when they talk about vision just to show that, to disqualify vision for immunity, they always refer to mirror. When you look at yourself in a mirror. And so it's, for instance, this very famous example of Ernst Mach, who get into the bus and he saw a shabby pedagogue at the end of the bus, and actually it was himself reflected in a mirror at the end of the bus. And that shows typically that you can be mistaken about who is this body when you look at the mirror. However, the question I want to raise is whether in more natural circumstances, one vision can sometimes guarantee immunity. So, to do that, I would just want you to compare two kinds of self-portraits. So, most from several feet. This is a famous portrait from Van Gogh. You can see him from the outside, and that's more or less a classic way of doing self-portrait. But there are another type of self-portrait. Still, we go back to Ernst Mach, and that's what the artist looks like from his own point of view, not from the outside, but from his own point of view, from what we might say zero distance. And that's the perspective that you have here, where he sees slightly his nose and a bit of his torso and his legs. And the question is I have is, do these two, let's say the judgment based on these two self-portraits, do they have the same epistemic behavior? And I want to argue that they do not have the same epistemic behavior. Because if you take Mach's visual spatial perspective on his own body, it's such that it is anatomically impossible that it could be another individual body that you see. Okay, if we go back here, there is just no way that it could be someone else's body, and it's not anatomically possible. So, in a way, his visual perspective on his body is self-specific, because it could not be someone else's body, it can be only his own body. And because of that, because it's kind of privileged access to his own body, in the same way that body senses give a privileged access to one's own body. And because of that, it can guarantee bodily immunity. So Mach cannot rationally doubt that this is his own body when he sees it from such visual spatial perspective. And actually, it's interesting, but in Gareth Evans, so after he mentioned proprioception, the sense of balance, and so on and so forth, that says that he could ground bodily immunity. In a footnote, he says that we might maybe add among the possible grounds for bodily immunity the fact of looking down to one's body. And in a way, that's what it's come about. There is some visual experiences that are able to ground bodily immunity. Another example that is quite simple, you don't need to be able to draw, is just you close one eye and you look at your nose, and there is just no way that it could be someone else's nose. And it's just anatomically impossible. And here again, we want to say that there is room for errors from the identification when it comes to the nose that you see that way. Again, it seems there is no room and it's immune to error. So, what I want to say is that if we go back to body senses and proprioception, we have said before that proprioception de facto guarantees bodily immunity because of some anatomical facts about the human body. That means that the proprioceptive neural system is connected only to one's own body. Well, we might say as well that there are other anatomical facts such that it secures a link between some visual content and one's own body. If I see my body from this perspective, if you have it, then that is from a self-specific perspective, then it guarantees bodily immunity. So we see our body at a location and with an angle that are physically compatible only with our body. And then if we do so, our judgment based on this kind of vision will be immune to errors with identification. So why is it so? Part of the story behind that is the fact that it's an invariant relation between our body and this visual perspective. Because the body that we see that way has always been our own. So we could say that our cognitive system, our perceptual system, has evolved with this invariant fact, making self-identification superfluous. You don't need it, because it's always your body, so why would you bother to do it? It's just, it comes at a cost to it, identify something, identify an object. So if you don't need to identify, because you know there is just no other possibility, you just dispense with a self-identification. Therefore, you cannot doubt that the body is one's own when seen that way. And it's important that it's invariant, that it's from the beginning that the perceptual system has evolved in such a way. Because imagine a story of Robinson Crusoe. On his island, he's alone, there is no other bodies. You could say, well, all his judgment should be immune to error because he has the only body on the island. But I think that because it's just, he was born in a city where there were plenty of bodies, his visual system has evolved in such a way with the hypothesis that there could be other bodies. And therefore, even when he's alone, he keeps on identifying, because that's how his visual system has evolved. So that's where we are now. There are some visual experiences that guarantee body image. But of course, it's just a limited set of visual experiences. I'm not saying that any visual experience guarantees bodily immunity. For instance, if I see my hand just like that, it's obvious that it could be my hand, but it could be also someone else's hand. So what happens in this kind of situation? So what happens when bodily experiences are multimodal and they involve visual experiences that, when they are visual experiences that do not guarantee bodily immunity? So do multimodal bodily experiences still guarantee immunity despite the involvement of vision, which does not always guarantee immunity? So I think that in order to assess the immunity of judgments that are multimodal, that are based on visual proprioceptive integration, for example, one needs to analyze the basic principle of multisensory integration. So another way to present the problem is the following. You have proprioception that tells you my hand is 10 centimeters on the left. You have, for example, if you wear a prism, you have vision that tells you that your hand is 20 centimeters on the left, and your bodily judgment will be, I feel my hand 15 centimeters on the left. So the question is my judgment, I feel my hand 20 centimeters on the left, is immune or not? Well, according to the exclusive thesis, the exclusive bodily immunity thesis, the reply should be no, because as I said before, the exclusive bodily is exclusive, that is, it's no bodily immunity if multimodal grounds. So, but now I will try to challenge the first assumption that claims that it has to be exclusive. So let's go back to the rubber hand illusion. Here we have a case where vision interferes with touch and proprioception, and we have a case also where the way I see my hand does not guarantee immunity. So my visual experience does not suffice to guarantee immunity. So what happened? Does this illusion result from an error of identification or not? Well, it depends whether visual somatosensory integration requires a prior step of self-identification. If it requires identification, then it could happen that there is misidentification. But if I can show that actually the multisensory integration does not require identification, then it will show that it is immune to error. So multisensory integration, just kind of 101 on multisensory integration. So multisensory integration is of use only when the signals from various sensory modalities carry information about the same object or event. In other words, it's no use to combine information and visual information about my body with proprioceptive information about my body with visual information about your body, because that will just lead to an error. So you should not do that. You should make sure that it's the same source that is at stake in the two signals, that the two signals carry information about the same object. And neuroscientists have argued that you need, I quote, clearly control mechanisms are needed to regulate which sensory input should be integrated. And more or less that's a problem that we have also in the binding literature. You know, like in unimodal experiences, like in visual experiences, you need to bind shape and color. And the question is always, how do you bind the right shape with the right color when there are several objects on the table with different shape and different color? And one of the challenges to explain binding in visual experiences is to say, well, you have to integrate the properties that are instantiated by the same object. So that's more or less the same problem. But what are those mechanisms, and in particular what interests us? Do they require an identification component? So this problem was, and this issue was first well recognized by the psychologist Welch and Warren, who claims that multisensory integration necessarily depends on cognitive factors unity. And I will quote them. An intersensory conflict can be registered as such only if the two sensory modalities are providing information about a sensory situation that the observer has strong reason to believe, not necessarily consciously, signify a single unitary distal object or event. So more or less, what you have, according to them, what you need to have, if you want to integrate information coming from different sensory modalities, you need to believe that these two sensory information come about the same object. So one interpretation of that is that there is kind of, we need first to primarily identify that what one sees is a hand that one feels. So it seems to be a very high level mechanism that is required before any kind of multisensory integration, which is quite surprising. And if it's true, then of course that will show that multisensory integration requires identification. Therefore, multimodal bodily judgment requires an identification. If it requires an identification, then it cannot be in unilateral. And therefore, the more multimodal bodily judgment there are, the less unity there will be. However, I think that if we look, more or less it's an empirical question, and if we look at the empirical research, then there is no real justification for the hypothesis that it requires really such a high-level cognitive mechanism. Because on the one hand, when you look at multisensory integration by looking at brain imaging studies, what happens is that you see effect at a very, very, very basic level. So you can have effect, for example, on vision on the primary somatosensory areas. So it's very, very, very early on. So it will be surprising that you have to go to the belief stage before going back to the primary somatosensory areas. But I will leave that to the neuroscientists and go back more just to the psychological data. And here again, it seems that we don't need to identify the bodies that we see when we look at the data. For instance, participants who were present, what has been shown is that they have no conscious access to the original proprioceptive information. Even if they are told, so even if they believe that there is a conflict or that the hand belongs to someone else, so even when they believe that the proprioceptive information is not about the same hand than the visual information, they still integrate the two information. So it would be hard to see how it would be compatible with Rush and Warren's claim. And if you look at the rubber hand illusion, again, it seems that the similarity between the rubber hand and your own hand can be very minimal. Actually at the very beginning, when they started the illusion, they used a Halloween bloody rubber hand. So, it's just obvious that this cannot be your own hand, and the appearance is completely different. And they have shown so that the skin color can be different, that the handedness can be different. So it could be left rubber hand and it's your right rubber hand that is strong, your right hand that is strong. The gender could be different, everything more or less can be different. All that is required is that it looks like your hand, that's at least you need that. That the rubber hand and the real hand are partially congruent. So you cannot have the rubber hand in this position and your hand in this position. And that the stroking is synchronous, but that's it, that's all you need. So it seems to be quite minimal, and it doesn't seem like you need to identify your hand. So it's unlikely, because one possibility would be to say, well, first you feel that the hand is F, then you see that the hand, the C is F, and then you judge that the hand, the C is their own hand, and then they interpret what they feel without the C. So it seems very awkward that we need so high-level mechanism where it seems that it resists to all kinds of dissimilarities between the rubber hand and the real hand. So rather than to say that you need self-identification and then you have a sensory integration, we could say, so that would be the idea if we follow Welch and Warren. You have self-identification and then you can integrate the information. But however, it might be rather the reverse. You have multisensory integration, and then you self-identify. So it would be rather this way. So rather than to posit a kind of very high-level mechanism, we can say perceptual assignment. So it's true that there needs to be a registration at some level that the signals are about one's body. But the registration does not necessarily need to be at the cognitive level. And in the same way that there is a perceptual mechanism that selects the relevant elements like shape and color to bind together as a single entity in unimodal experiences, there may be a perceptual mechanism of selection of the relevant information to integrate together in multimodal experiences. And if so, one can then dispense with self-identification. No self-identification, the hand I see is my hand, but rather a multimodal comparator, for example, like spatial-temporal consistency, or could be at stake in the phenomenon of multisensory integration. And this principle of how the comparator works, why and how this multimodal binding works, are very interesting. But again, they are not at stake with the question of immunity, because the immunity is really at the level of belief, of identification, so it's really not the same level. So I'm going to the end, and what I wanted to show in this talk is that the bodily immunity thesis is true, but not the exclusive bodily immunity thesis. So it's true that bodily self-ascription are immune to error if grounded on body senses, and we have seen that somatoparaphrenia and the rubber hand illusion do not constitute valid counterexample to the bodily immunity thesis. However, the grounds of bodily self-ascription may be more complex than predicted by most classical accounts and than predicted, at least by bodily immunity thesis. So one needs a finer brain and not a finger brain. It's talking so much about the body, I guess. You can have this kind of problem. So one needs a finer brain analysis of the grounds that are appropriate. And you should not have the level of individuation of sensory modalities like say, vision versus proprioception. It's not fine-grained enough. But you need rather an analysis at the level of the content of the perceptual experience. And you should extend the list of appropriate grounds to include not only body senses, but also visual experiences in some circumstances, and multisensory bodily experiences. Thank you.
We'll take some questions.
So, would you be willing to say more about blind patients?
I don't think we should call them patients.
Sorry. So, blind individuals.
Yeah.
So visual impairments come in all shapes and sizes, right? And one could grow up with the ability to actually see and then perhaps develop glaucoma later in life.
Yeah.
So what would you say about that? It seems to me like what you're wanting to say is that they have a deficient sense of self-knowledge, or bodily knowledge, that is.
So yeah, there is a real difference whether you're congenitally blind or whether it's acquired blindness. And it's the most striking is when for the congenitally blind, because in this one example that I think for me is the most striking. So it's another experiment that has shown that if maybe you know the Japanese illusion, where you do something like that and you are touched on one finger and you have to move it. And it's actually very difficult. And not only the posture is difficult, but really identifying the good finger that you're supposed to move. And part of the reason is that because you say, well, it's on my right hand and my right hand, touch on my right hand is always on my right hand no matter the posture it has. But it actually here it's on my right hand, but because it's on the left and then it's on the right, well, we get all mixed up. But that's because you have your tactile sensation is remarked in the external frame of reference. It's not marked only on your skin, so right hand is always the right hand. It's also in the external world, but your right hand can be on the left. And if you do that with congenitally blind people, they don't have difficulties. because they do not map that tactile sensation in the external world like we do. And if you try that with acquired, so with people who have become blind after 5 years old, they have difficulties. So the idea is that developmental regulation really plays a key role to set up the frame of reference in which you will encode your bodily sensation. So the first 5 years are the most important, and then it's okay. So that's one example. But you could imagine a situation also when I was talking about the body metrics, the body size. If you become blind when you're a child, then there is no difference because you've grown up, hopefully, and therefore you don't know the size of your limbs. But if you become blind when you are 20 years old, then you will have okay. So there are different versions of the severity of blindness. But really what is most striking is when you are congenitally blind, then there are real different, I would say, structural differences between their bodily experiences and our bodily experiences.
So I'm wondering if I can do sort of recap of the immunity thesis, because I'm not sure if I got this, but it seems like the immunity thesis is going to claim that whatever claims you make about your own body are going to be immune from error, so they're supposed to be true in all contexts as long as some criteria is met. And in this example, you have vision as being a key sort of criterion for deciding whether claims about yourself are going to be true. But it seems to me like these different criteria will be violated if you change the context of what you mean by body in these different cases. So with the vision cases, what you mean to somebody about, when you're talking to them about claims about their body, if they're moving their hand or not, by body you mean something like an extension of your torso when you're talking about your arm, so something that's attached to your torso. And in these cases you can clearly see that their claims are going to be false, so they're not immune to error, even though they have vision as something that's being used for them. So I'm kind of unclear on how it is that these different case studies don't actually count as counterexamples when it seems like what you mean by something like body in these contexts is something that can be decided true or false.
I'm not sure I fully understand the point of it. So why would it be false if it's just what is after your torso or what's following your torso? I'm not sure to understand why you say it would be false.
Well,
are you talking about the patient study?
Well, the doctor would ask the
okay, for the somatoparaphonic patient. So you were talking.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So they are aware that it's in continuity with the rest of the body, actually. So, and despite that, I mean, like, no matter the way you call them, or what I have to say, and one thing I didn't mention is that there is no case of patient with this disorder who are not paralyzed. So there won't be a situation where they will be moving. Besides that, they are aware that this arm is on the contiguity of the torso, that it's attached to their body, and the fact is that despite that, and they have sensation, as I said, they do not make the self-ascription. But the fact that that's the problem more generally about false negative, is like the fact that they have the good reason. I'm saying just that the bodily immunity thesis say just if you had a good reason, then your judgment will be true. But you have to make the judgment. And the fact you have the good reason does not suffice to make the judgment. And no matter the context, I mean, you have always a context where you could have a good reason, but you don't listen. I mean, like when your friends tell you advice, and they give you the good reason, you just don't listen to them. And that's more or less the situation. They have the good reason to believe that this is their own body, but they take other reason to defeat the reason, the good reason that they have. So in a way, you could say they make a rational mistake because they doubt that it is their body, but their doubt is not rational; it's irrational. I'm not sure.
Well, if it's an irrational doubt, then how can
In that case, they have a good reason, but they don't make the good choice, so you would say it's irrational. I mean, classically, you would say that.
So thanks, that was really terrific. I'm wondering, with the, I think it was the Mach stuff when you were looking at the pictures from your own perspective, the nose and so on, if in the end immunity is really the right characterization at all, or if it isn't just that in most circumstances the world is such that it couldn't but be my body, and so I'm not practically ever wrong. And yet, immunity seems to be something much stronger where there's a sense that I couldn't be wrong. And so we've got the rubber arm illusion, and I can imagine clever experimenters in 20 years coming up with the rubber nose illusion, and so now, or you know, the rubber pants illusion or something. So that you can push these limits, and some of these paralyzed patients have broken the natural balance, and so things have come apart a little bit for them. But so there's not really an immunity, but it's just that the world generally cooperates pretty well.
It's a fair enough question, and at some point I asked myself whether you could have de facto and contingently de facto immunity or something like that. Like you could have levels of de facto-ness, I don't know how to call it, for immunity. And actually, I'm not so sure that we want to, I mean, you could say that immunity is not such a big phenomenon. I think I will be on your side. In a way, I don't want to say that it's something very mysterious and so on. For me, as I said, at least in the case of bodily self-ascription, it more or less derives from anatomical facts. The fact that one day science or crazy psychology could just play around with these anatomical facts, and then possible that I would have a rubber nose, or that I would be connected to another body. And you could see that happen, but I'm not sure I see real asymmetry between proprioception and vision, except that for vision it would be easier, maybe technically easier, but I don't see a principal distinction, asymmetry between the two. It's just at the end of the day a question of how the position of our eyes are located relative to the rest of the body, or about how our proprioceptive system is connected to our body. But that's it. And that's, in a way, you could say yes. So you are showing that immunity is not that interesting, that deep. And I'm not saying no.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Mine has to do with the clarification over the fake rubber hand experiment. Okay. You might have explained it already, but maybe I missed it. Okay, so the person places both their hands into this, what is it, case or something like that? Do they, like, at least initially recognize one of their hands as their actual hand and the other hand as a rubber hand? Or are they immediately, like,
what happens is like, I mean, you don't even need a case. I mean, more or less you can do it afterwards if you want. You don't need even a rubber hand, you can do someone else's hand.
I was going by the diagram.
Yeah, so it's just like you see a hand in front of you, and you don't see your own hand.
Okay.
That's it. You just start with that. So your own hand could be behind the table, it could be just wherever, you just don't see it.
Okay.
And what you see is another hand. And you have the tactile sensation on your hand, or at least the tactile stimulation on your hand. And you see the paintbrush stroking exactly at the same rhythm, exactly at the same location, the rubber hand and your own hand. So you have this spatial-temporal congruency between the tactile stimulation on your hand and the tactile stimulation on the rubber hand. But from the subject's point of view, so that's the experimental description. From the subject perspective, at the beginning, what you feel, I want to say that it's not everybody who has the experience, but for me, what happened for me at least, is that I start like, okay, so what? Nothing happening. I feel sensation on my hand, and there is this stupid rubber hand in front of me. And after a while, because what they do, sometimes they push the congruency, the synchronicity, and they start being asynchronous. And then it feels very bizarre because what you see does not match what you feel. And when you go back to being synchronous, then you start feeling that actually you are touched on the rubber hand. So, but there's, that's the best I can characterize it. So I don't know whether it replies to your question.
No, yeah. Yeah, it does.
So you don't need, it's not like you see the rubber hand. And, of course you are in an experiment.
Yeah,
And for some people it can be very impressive. It's funny, like trying that on philosophers. Like for instance with Mel Bloch, I had a kind of wow reaction. But for others it doesn't work, so I don't know what it shows.
A question from the internet. This is from Sarah Jones at Northern Michigan University. She says, it seems the point of the strong bodily immunity to error thesis as you present it is that the deliverances of the bodily senses as a totality are themselves alone immune to error. Your examples do not show, therefore, that this thesis is false. You seem to not have provided any counterexample to this. A counterexample would have to establish either a case where proprioceptive awareness alone leads to misidentification, or that another modality does guarantee in totality of its deliverances of immunity from error.
Okay.
Do you want me to read that again?
I'm not sure I could say everything. So I think that she agrees with me, I'm not sure. Like she said that I haven't shown counter evidence, I agree. I'm not sure I catch a point about totality. So I don't know whether she wants to say that I've been talking only about body parts and not the body as a whole, or whether she wants to say something else. So if someone wants to help me, I'm not sure to really...
I'll read it again.
Can you read it again? Yeah.
It seems the point of the strong bodily immunity error thesis as you present it is that the deliverances of the bodily senses as a totality are themselves alone immune to error. Your examples do not show, therefore, that this thesis is false.
Yeah? Oh.
So she's just said something else here. She says...
Thank you, Sergeant.
The totality of the deliverances of the sense is what she means. So in that final statement where she says, you seem to not have provided any counterexample to this. A counterexample would have to establish either a case where proprioceptive awareness alone leads to misidentification, or that another modality does guarantee in totality of its deliverances of the sense.
So maybe she wants to say that for vision it's just some visual experiences that can guarantee immunity, but not all, and therefore I do not show that there are really other grounds of multimodality, and I don't think that's what I said. I think that we need, maybe it's just we don't need this totality level, but we really need something more fine-grained, and each judgment based on a specific perceptual ground, and that's what matters. Is case by case, and we cannot make generality. It's really case by case. In the case, if we take case by case for body senses, then we will always have immunity. If we take case by case intuition, we will not always have immunity. And what I argued also is that with multimodality, with the modal judgment, if it results from multisensory integration, and multisensory integration does not rely on identification, then all judgments that are based on multisensory integration will guarantee bodily immunity. I hope that helps.
Okay, so she's just clarified, I'll say one further thing from Sarah Jones. She says, the question is really, are there any senses other than proprioception that guarantee identification?
Yeah, okay. So that it's not only, I use proprioception because it's the easiest, but also tactile sensation, of course, and also the sense of heat, the sensation of heat and cold on your skin, or the sense of balance. So if, for instance, I have my eyes closed and I feel tilted, you feel dizzy. I mean, typically when you feel dizzy, that's your sense of balance that tells you that there's something wrong. Then the body that I feel tilted, let's put it that way, cannot be but my own body. So again, you have a case where you have immunity to error. And there is no counter evidence of that as far as I know.
Mine's just a very short and simple question of clarification. I have an idea of what I think the answer might be, but I don't know because I'm not up to date with cognitive science. Is the multi-modal integration in these, situations where you study the effects of how different senses integrate together, is the effect so strong and so primary that no amount of directed, selective attention can break?
That's a good question. So when I describe for prisons adaptation, like here you have a case that no matter what, it's very robust. You can have all kinds of conditions, and I mean, as I said, even if subjects are aware that there is a conflict, that's where the hand is not where they see it, still they have the integration. So, so you could say that's one way to apply. Still, I think that if you do not pay attention to what you see, I would be very surprised that it has an effect on what you feel. But that's just that. The fact is that attention, has been said to play a role in binding for visual experiences, for like Treisman theory or John Campbell's theory that really put a lot of weight on attention for binding. And I think that attention also plays a role for multimodal binding. So yes, you need to pay attention to the visual stimulus if you want it to have an effect on your body senses. But it doesn't mean that, but still, there is something quite robust, like even when you are told that someone else and when you are aware of the conflict, that you could say that you have other kind of attention on it, and still it works. So it's important here to distinguish the kind of attention, kind of more bottom-up attention, so just driven by the stimulus outside and the top-down attention. I think that you need the bottom-up attention. The top-down attention might not be necessary.
So I probably just misunderstood, but I was wondering if you could explain a little more why you think the rubber hand illusion is not a counterexample to the quantum illusion.
So it was confusing. So I think there are two reasons for that. And at the beginning, I argue if we just want to criticize the bodily immunity thesis, the bodily immunity thesis is about body senses. And rubber hand illusion is typically a case where you have vision. So what is important is whether you vision, when you have vision, whether it prevents immunity. Whether when there is an involvement of vision, there is immunity. And what I argued in this last part of the talk is that because in the rubber hand illusion, at no stage do you need to identify the hand that you see as your own hand. There is no possibility of misidentification. There is no identification component. So is it? Should I try it again? Yeah.
I was just wondering if I could add to that. So then, what if you ask the patient if they identify with that rubber hand, and the patient says, "Yes, I fully identify with it." It seems like in this case, you've got vision coming in, and it seems.
So the patient was the subject in the rubber hand illusion.
So it would be the subject, right?
Yeah.
In the rubber hand experiment. So if they do verbally express their identification, does your thesis still hold?
Yes, because the identification does not play a role in that judgment. What is important is the grounds of the judgment. So what is prior to the judgment. So, and you could have also consequences of your judgment. So if they identify the hand, and actually they do, when the guy said, I look at the dummy hand thinking it was actually my own. So that's a kind of identification, you could say. But that's a consequence of the multisensory integration. It's not so that's more or less the output, but it's not part of the grounds of the judgment. So he doesn't, so more or less, when he says, I feel touch on the rubber hand, it does not result from this identification. The identification results from the multisensory integration. So just the direction of causality. I'm not saying there is no identification, I'm just saying that it doesn't play a role in building up. So it's not part of the reason that leads to the judgment. And because it's not part of the reason, it does not affect an inclination of immunity.
Well, sorry, I don't want to press this too far, but so what if you did the same experiment but you blindfolded the patient or the subject? In that case, I think you would just...
Well, you would not have the illusion because there is a rubber hand illusion, you need vision.
Right, exactly, and I think that would be why it would show that vision is playing a role.
It's playing a role, but not identification.
So, okay.
You don't need to self-identify. You don't need, more or less, what I'm saying is that when I say, I feel touch on the rubber hand, at no point, if we kind of reconstruct the rational structure that leads to this judgment, does the subject make the following judgment? This rubber hand is my own hand.
So I was, when you were willing to weaken your notion of immunity when you responded to this question, I was wondering if there might be other differences we could also come up with other than just nasty clever psychologists devising tricky experiments. But I was thinking of cases of, say, when someone is having an out-of-body experience or when they've ingested a particular set of substances that what Aldous Huxley describes in Dose of Perception. It looks like you can have wildly peculiar ways of identifying with not merely your own body, but other people's bodies as well when you're in those situations. And whether that also poses a challenge to how strong it looks like those are diffusers to immunity to error if you've ingested really strange chemical substances that let you identify with other people's body parts. I haven't done this, I don't know if that's really what happened, but by the reports which I've read, really, really strange things can happen, and they look like the types of diffusers that would make us call into question whether immunity to error is perhaps too strong of a way of describing it.
So,
does ingesting strange drugs genuinely count as a
an easy way to answer your question would be to say, well, as I said, I'm using Jim Pryor kind of view of immunity and immunity. So his way of spelling out immunity is, I cannot rationally doubt that this is my hand. In this case, when you take drugs, I will say that the rationally, you just cross it. But more seriously, one thing is like, the notion of immunity, I always shorten it because it's too long, but it's immunity to errors with identification relative to the first person. So, the fact that you can have strange identification or relation to other people's bodies, that will not fall into this category because it's really relative to the first person. Really, when I use the I or when I use my, when I use the first person, whether I can be wrong in my use of the self. So to go back to Wittgenstein, it's really whether can I be wrong in my use of the self as a subject. And actually, I'm not the person who instantiates this property when I have the good way, when the appropriate way to know about the property. So in this case, and that's one way, another thing also is I would say that these drugs probably affect the grounds themselves, and the whole idea, I guess, is that your perceptual experiences are bizarre. So because the grounds themselves are distorted, then you will say, well, do you want to take these distorted perceptual experiences to evaluate what happens for the standard or normal perceptual experiences? I would say that, you could do that, but then you will really, that would be cheating a little bit.
One more question. Thanks. I really want to thank you for that talk. I enjoyed it a lot.
I'm just looking at the conclusion, one of the conclusions that you have on the slide there. And so you say that the finer-grained analysis should be about at the level of the content of the perceptual experiences. And I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what you mean by the content of the perceptual experiences.
Oh.
And I'm wondering about the word perceptual there too, because sometimes we use the word perceptual as a success term. So to perceive means that in some ways already correct.
Okay, so that's quite a vicious question about content and perception. So let's put it that way. I think the distinction I draw is mainly between sensory and perceptual. Sensory is more or less the mechanism. That's more or less, if you compare that with a theater where you have what is backstage, what more or less the ropes and the light and everything. And perceptual is the stage, what you can have access to, what you can be aware of. So when I talk about multisensory integration, for instance, I want to say that you have all these sensory signals coming and mixing and so on. When I talk about multimodal experiences, I want to say that's what the output of all this mechanism, causal mechanism. So the output, what you are aware of, are these multimodal perceptual experiences. So that's what I mean by perceptual. I hope this helps. For content, I have, I'm a representationalist about perceptual experiences, so I believe that, for example, bodily experience can be articulated with the that clause. So when I say I feel my leg crossed, what I mean is that I feel that my legs are crossed, and what I mean by content is that my legs are crossed. And I think indeed that it has truth condition, a satisfaction condition, and that it could be true or false. And for that, I just have kind of standard, I don't know if that's standard, but I'm more like, let's say, Dwetzky side of the story, to shorten a little bit.
Okay, we're out of time for questions, but I hope you'll all join us for a drink at the Spoke now. And let's thank our speaker.